You're listening to Discography Discussion, episode 162, War of Ages, hosted by Dan Terry.
In the summertime, it's real thick, sweet iced tea.
David Van Zandt.
I thought you were going to say swill.
With no...
It might be that too.
Yeah.
And Joseph Wren.
There's some new info for you.
Oh, shit.
Take that one to the bank. That's hilarious.
Presented by discussmetal.com. And if you opened before Doomsday and got exactly what you wanted, then you are ready for this episode of Discography Discussion. I am Joe. That is Dan. That is David. It's War of Ages tonight, guys.
It is the war of all of the ages, all combined into one massive battle.
The Age of War.
It's definitely starting to sound more like a big box PC game to me.
Civilization 5, anybody?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 6 or 4. Only play the even-numbered games. That's what the people tell me.
I've never played well, no, that's not true. So I played a Civilization game back in, I don't know, the 90s. And as soon as my steel war mechs got defeated by a bunch of natives with sticks and arrows, I was like, I'm done with this game.
It's all about Age of Empires, man. The War of Ages of Empire.
Age of Empires 2 is the shit. I don't even care if it's the HD version. I love that game.
Hey guys, David's back.
What's going on, guys?
How you doing, David?
Good. Thanks for having me. Thanks for hanging out.
Raise your hand if you're in quarantine. I'm just kidding. Nobody can see what we're saying.
Nobody can see us. Yeah, we can see us, but that's it.
Quarantine at a coffee shop making frappuccinos all day.
Now the audience will never know.
Well, we thought breaking David in with a rap episode, which is the true way to see if you can co-host a podcast successfully, is everybody get out of their comfort zone for a little while. Well, we're going to dive head first back into the comfort zone and to the sweet, soulful music of War of Ages.
Low and slow, baby.
Metalcore as fuck.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one way to describe it. This band is metalcore. I don't think any of us have any real issues. The only genre tag they have anywhere you look them up online is just metalcore. They don't care. They're not upset about it. They're just trying to do metalcore the best that they can do it.
And they do it some of the best around. Metalcore, heavy on the metal, easy on the core.
Absolutely. I think Leroy's voice at this point is the only thing that's still super core about the band. Super core. But War of Ages is quite the band. And it's funny, too, whenever I looked into doing this episode, I was like, War of Ages, they've only got 4 albums, right? Yeah, this band's been up to some stuff since they debuted, I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I look at all of these albums. Although 2 of them are the same album, which we'll get into. But yeah, it looks like they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 9 albums.
I was just trying to count up. Yeah, we're looking at 9 albums. Count them all.
And that's since 2005. I mean, that's pretty incredible, and all on Face Down Records.
The longest tenured face down band right now. Them and My Epic, but War of Ages beats them out by a little bit.
Just a hair, yeah. Talk about 2 totally different. When are we going to do a My Epic episode? It's going to have to be really deep, so deep. It'll be like a 5.5-hour podcast.
They have too many EPs. You wouldn't be down.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Well, before we throw sand on the fire from the tomb, I want to take this time to say thank you to everyone for listening to the podcast. Thank you for listening and for subscribing. If you are not a subscriber, then you can find everything Discography Discussion at discussmetal.com. We are on Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher, so if you have an Amazon Echo or a Google Home, you have no excuse. Ask it to play the latest episode of the Discography Discussion podcast, and it will. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter at Discuss Metal. Be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe. It really helps us out. It lets us know you're listening. And now Dan is going to tell us all about 5-star reviews.
Hey guys, Dan here. And I just wanted to tell you that 5-star reviews, we love them. They make us feel good. You guys have heard me make this speech 1,000 times. Thank you guys for reviewing the episodes like you have done. Thank you for telling us how you feel about the episodes on Discord. Thank you for sharing the episodes on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it. You guys are awesome. And there's nothing better than when I see that our episode posted and I'm at work. And then I get home from work and realize that you guys have already shared the episodes all over the internet. So that is less work for me, which I love, but I still go ahead and repost it anyway so we can get banned for spamming. So, I really appreciate that, and I think you guys are awesome, and keep it up. Over on YouTube, in response to episode 88, Cannibal Corpse, Curly Q says, I disagree with you guys on some things, but I agree with you on Chris Barnes not being able to keep up with the newer shit. It's like, yeah, that's just undeniable. Because like, if you listen to Cannibal Corpse and how fast they went on Vile, they definitely and then you go listen to like 6 Feet Under with Chris Barnes, and it's like a slower, like groove death metal type thing. Dude just wanted to slow down. He wanted to chill out, and that is just not what the boys in the Corpse wanted to do. So that's cool. No, we definitely we were just saying before we went on the air that that's one of our most divisive episodes, that and Pantera. Like, people either hate everything we said about Cannibal Corpse, or they're like 100% on our side. So I kind of like this one, that I agree with you guys on some things, but disagree with you on some other things. That's a moderate, well-balanced point of view.
He definitely thinks it's thrash metal. I'm just saying.
No, he doesn't. Nobody thinks that but you. That's just ridiculous. Hi, we're the genre police.
Woo! Excuse me, sir. Do you know how much metalcore you were playing just now?
So much metalcore.
Never enough.
So, Dan, tell me about War of Ages.
War of Ages is a Christian metal band, or a Christian metalcore band, or just a metalcore band. I mean, they're whatever you want them to be, but it's probably going to be metalcore, so you should probably want them to be that. And I'm not saying it like a bad thing. You're going to find out just how much I love metalcore if you were, in the dark about that prior to this. They were around as a band called Point Zero whenever they first started, and then in 2005 they became War of Ages, which I have to say, definitely a way better name.
I mean, they were more like rap rock back then too. They weren't even like full-fledged metalcore back then. So the name change totally makes sense.
Oh my God, do you have demos?
I don't have demos. I'm just going based off of word of mouth. I mean, they maybe rap rock. That's just
I need to hear Leroy rap. I need to hear that. That needs to be something that I hear.
You kind of hear it every now and then, but I mean, it's out there. They have an EP, Unite Us All, so it's out there somewhere. I don't think I've ever heard.
I'll find it. I'll stay up real late tonight and find it, and then send you a report in the morning. Yeah. Or I'll just start hitting up Leroy on Facebook, like, hey, so I know that you have this demo.
Watch it not be rap rock at all, then everyone in the Face Down group like calls me out and like takes away my admin status because I said they were rap rock and it was like totally different. I'm just waiting for that.
It's like grindcore, yeah.
Yeah, right. Leroy himself shows up at my door.
He's like, I can't think of anybody less qualified to talk about this.
Yeah, exactly. Why'd you guys invite me on?
These guys have had a hell of a career. I mean, from 2005 all the way to present day, with their newest album Void coming out in 2019. It's kind of refreshing to talk about a band that's still going, I feel like a lot of the times we're like, yeah, and then they just all disappeared one day. That's not the case with the War of Ages. War of Ages has been in your city multiple times. They really got popular more. I mean, and I don't want to say they didn't get popular because their music was good, but they got popular because they were road warriors, man. This band toured so extensively, especially in the early days. I mean, it was like literally every single show poster I saw was like blah, 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 and War of Ages, whether they were headlining or not. They were when they weren't headlining, they were support. I mean, they were just all over these United States, and even into Europe. So this is actually really exciting. This is the first week where I've really sat down and listened to all of it at once. I listened to the records as they came out. And so there were a few of them that it was kind of a revisit for me. Some I loved, some I didn't, but I guess the only place to start is at the very beginning.
2005, War of Ages.
Oh boy.
Do you like metalcore? Do you like Haste the Day style metalcore? Are you a fan of Kill Switch Engage?
I was thinking more like As LA Dying style metalcore, a little bit with the Kill Switch Engage maybe. They definitely didn't start off as the most original band in the world, but I remember seeing them at Cornerstone and buying their shirt. Shirt. It just doesn't fit me anymore. I haven't worn that shirt in a long time. It was like a medium, somewhere between a large and a medium.
A medium.
It became a medium after I washed it.
They're perfect.
But they were playing on a day where it was nothing but Face Down bands. Although the first record, we say that they've been on Face Down for such a long time. They actually started off on Strike First Records, as Joe and I hashed out during the Hope for the Dying episode, that Strike First was kind of like the minor leagues for Face Down. It was like, yeah, we'll put out your record, but we'll just kind of see how it goes.
Yeah, it's like training grounds. Make sure you can cut it.
Well, the thing that I thought was interesting about this record and what drew me to War of Ages as a band was that solos, man. Like, there's a lot of metalcore out there that year for sure. Like 2005 is not like the innovative year for metalcore, but these guys had a very like heavy metal sensibility to their music, in that, you know, you've still got the breakdowns, you've got the screamed vocals, you've got the double kick drumming, you've got all that stuff that you'd expect out of metalcore. Yeah, a few rip-offs of At the Gates, In Flames type of riffing. But they played solos. They constructed songs like traditional heavy metal songs, but they were playing metalcore. And so the thing that I found the most interesting was that they would just solo for what seemed like forever. Like when I was watching them at Cornerstone, it seemed like their set took forever. Like not in a bad way, but just that their songs were a little bit more complicated than what I'd been used to seeing that year.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying earlier. Like they're metalcore heavy on, like, pun intended, because Steve Brown on the Axe, he just absolutely shreds. And I just saw him live a couple weeks ago at Face Down Fest, and you're absolutely right. Like, they place their songs so close to the record, but it just seems like it goes on in a good way, because their solos are blister, and it starts, it comes out of nowhere. Like, there's no build up to it. Steve Brown just hits it and runs. I love the solos.
When I think about the tropes that annoyed me in 2005, 2006 in metalcore, I think of the constant sweep picking, the pull off As I Lay Dying style riffs that everybody was doing. There was too much of what was arguably a good thing, because it had been about 8-9 years since we had a really guitar riff heavy music style that was popular in metal. We had nu metal, which had the hardcore, the screaming, the hip hop, in some cases, style vocals. But with metalcore, this style of metalcore, it was basically groovy thrash metal. It wasn't their fault that everybody started doing the same As I Lay Dying tricks, but they are definitely that style of band in 2005. They're going to be that style of band for a very long time, but War of Ages is also one of the bands that you can name that you kind of feel the difference between them and other metalcore bands. It doesn't sound exactly like As I Lay Dying, which some of the heavier rip-off artists did. This one actually sounds like just a groovy breakdown band. This sounds more like Haste the Day to me than straight As I Lay Dying.
They were an original band that wasn't playing a super original style, I guess is really the way to put it.
Perfect way to
Absolutely.
describe it.
You know, metalcore wasn't like the most innovative genre in the world, but it didn't have to be that way for War of Ages to sound like War of Ages. I don't ever get them confused. You know, if I'm listening to a playlist and a War of Ages song comes on, I know it's them. Like there's no debate there, and there's really no other bands that really sound like they do. But what's interesting about this record is a lot of the stuff that people know about War of Ages is not really on this record, because like you would consider them to be kind of a cleaner cut, well-produced type of band, whereas this record is very raw. It's probably their most hardcore record on the production quality alone. It's a very, very raw record. It doesn't sound like it was recorded in $1 million studio. And for a guy like me, that's like perfect, because like those are some of the first metalcore type of records I'd ever heard. So I was kind of like into records that sounded like that. But I can understand how some people may have heard it and been like, "Ooh, this is kind of rough."
So like I heard it like years and years ago. I heard it after it, but I heard it years ago, then never really went back to it because I didn't have a physical copy. And like Joe, you were saying, it's almost impossible to find on the internet.
Absolutely.
And then in the Face Down group, we were talking about War of Ages, and I was like, yeah, man, I can't remember the self-titled. Like, I know they re-recorded it later on, but someone refreshed me how it sounded like. And Leroy actually jumped on and said something like, "Don't listen to it because it's nothing but accidental snare hit." And then now when I listen to it, that's all I think about. Like, it's still a great record. I love it. And like you were saying, the rawness of it, but then I just keep on thinking accidental snare hits.
Yeah, it definitely, like, I can't unhear it now. Certainly you've kind of ruined that record for me. Thank you very much.
Blame Leroy.
Yeah, now I hate both of you. So, it is what it is. But this was also the first thing I ever heard by War of Ages besides their live show, where I was like, "Hey, bro, how much for a CD?" And he's like, "How much you got?" And I was like, $7. And yeah, so I got a CD for $7. I hope they're not going to come back to like their merch guy that year and be like, "Hey, we definitely said 10 per CD."
It was probably them, man. Even to this day, Leroy slinging shirts at Face Down Fest the other week.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Well, what I think is, what I liked about this record too, again, the solos, the rawness, and there was something about the way Leroy sings on this record and following records where he emotes very well with his voice. He has a very kind of different sounding screaming voice than a lot of other metalcore vocalists in that, number one, he's a lot more understandable. He's not super growly, It's more the hardcore scream than it is the death metal growl, which, metalcore bands typically you pick one, and you kind of stick with that. His voice is always very easy to understand. There were some really cool spoken word parts, which I actually don't know if those were him or not. But they were I always liked it whenever they would drop out. Like there's this one song which is like, "With every breath in all that I am, I will make a stand." And it's funny because the first time I heard it, I thought that was the cheesiest thing in the world. But like, I don't know, if they ever made a version of that song that didn't have that, I'd be like, "Duh, I want my money back."
Yeah. Nostalgia makes it fonder.
Totally. Well, and I remember them doing it from the stage, and I think that was probably what really gripped me on it. Always sounds super sincere, really, really into the lyrical content, and he makes it sound epic. He makes it sound grand and important. And this isn't a band that's just writing like about their feelings. Like they really sell the whole like war and battle and all of that part of it.
Yeah, like what you were saying earlier, like whenever you have War of Ages in a playlist, you can always tell it's them. And I think a lot of that does come from Leroy. Like you're saying, his vocal style is completely unique. He has that, most of the hardcore side of the metalcore War of Ages sound comes from Leroy's voice. Mm-hmm. But the way he enunciates, like if you go through their lyrics and just kind of read their lyrics throughout their history, like it's, war and like you were saying, that kind of like the big battle themes, almost kind of like tongue in cheek and cheesy. But when it's coming out of Leroy's mouth, you're hanging on every single word. And then when you see it live, like their live show, like you're saying, it's so believable and you believe every word.
Totally. And that's why they had to take that live show, to everyone.
Everywhere.
But, this really wasn't the record that I don't feel that this was the record that put them on the map. I don't remember War of Ages really being that big of a deal until Pride of the Wicked came out.
2006.
Pride of the Wicked it sounds like if the first album sounded like a demo, this is like their major label debut. It's still rough. I feel like the guitars are heavier, the vocals are punchier, the drums are incredible. This is one of those records where everybody really stopped and started paying attention. Like, oh, this band War of Ages, what label are they signed on? And I remember actually thinking that they were a Solid State band for some reason, just because their stuff was so clean. And whenever I thought about Face Down, I just think of like hardcore bands like Seventh Star.
Exactly.
Stuff like that.
Yeah. And they came out at a time when Face Down was still very much considered like a hardcore punk label, and War of Ages kind of came in maybe as like the underdogs on the metal. But this album, like, I don't know, I have a reputation in that circle. Only like in like the heavy music, I'm always the guy that likes the first album or the first and second album, and a lot of that could be production value, like you were saying. I like the raw sound of it. Mm-hmm. This album is hands down my favorite War of Ages album, and it's still raw enough that it catches me. You're already talking about the guitar and Leroy's vocals, but on this one especially, the gang vocals, man. I'm a hardcore kid at heart. I was never really as huge into metal. Definitely more of a hardcore kid. And the gang vocals, like the start of Strength Within, where he's like, "Show me your strength," like that just gets my blood pumping so fast and so hard. Throughout this whole album, they have so many moments like that they kind of lose later on. But
that's one thing about War of Ages that I like compared to other metalcore bands. When I think of hardcore and metalcore themes, I think of bro and beat down, and everybody's gonna kick everyone else's ass, and we're all gonna slam dance and stomp through the pit and high step. and fucking hardcore dancing, if that's what you want to call it, even though it's just swinging your arms, doing fake karate. But when I think of War of Ages, it's not, we're going to fight everyone in this room. It's, this is a battle, and we're going to fight everybody else. They take that theme up a notch. And I don't know a lot of metalcore bands that do that.
It's like in the Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, where they're all losing the battle out there on the Gondor fields, and then the army of the undead shows up. That army is War of Ages. You know,
I love it. I love it.
That's the feeling that they instill on me, because like this record, just I don't know, it hits very powerfully. Like they come in full force. And I don't know if it's a production trick or if it's just them. I can't figure it out, but there's always this epic feel. And this is the first record that they really started to develop the War of Ages sound, or if you want a more negative term, formula. You know, like this is the like everything drops out, but the breakdown and Leroy's voice. And I don't know, like they're so breakdown heavy on this record, but like the War of Ages breakdown, I don't know how to describe it. Like the breakdown is effective, but like how they'll just come in with some like noodly lead guitar part right afterwards to like alleviate it. I don't know, like
yeah.
That's just like something that I've noticed that they do that I don't hear a lot of other bands do. And I think that's really overall what contributes to the epic feel of some of the songs and the gang vocals for sure.
Well, like even now, like album came out in 2006, and it's weird to say it's refreshing, but that's like exactly how I feel about it. This came out, well, one, I mean, just let's talk about the album cover. Like, definitely judge the book by cover on this one. I remember this came out in 2006. I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania at the time, so I was just like bombarded metalcore, especially Christian metalcore, with like August Burns Red, Texas in July. You know, This or the Apocalypse was coming out. There was just metalcore coming out of my ears. And then my drummer had this album in his back pocket, in his backpack, and he showed me, and I was like, what, dude, this album cover is insane. Who is this band? And he put it on, and just from the very beginning with Guide for the Helpless, and then you're saying the breakdowns, the gang chants, it just sounded so refreshing from everything else. That overly noodly guitars, overly, you know, tremolo picking, everything that metalcore was back in 2007 to 2008. War of Ages just had that heavier, hardcore vibe, with still like just Steve laying down insane riffs and guitar leads on top.
Yeah, I mean, the lead guitar work is very above average for this band in comparison to their contemporaries. And they're not overly technical. And that's the thing that actually draws me more to them, is that like they're not like up their own butt as far as like trying to be the most technical band on earth. Like, let's play this in a crazy time signature. They write songs. And it's more of a benefit, and kind of shows how this band had as much of appeal as they did, was because these songs are catchy. You remember the melodies, you remember what's being played. One of my biggest complaints about metalcore is you can listen to a whole album by a band. Like, for instance, As I Lay Dying, Shadows or Security record. Great record. All the songs sound the same. Like it's one good song.
Agreed.
You know? But with War of Ages, every song kind of has its own theme. Well, on Pride of the Wicked anyway. We'll get to some of the
especially
other
in
stuff,
the earlier stuff, for sure.
Yeah, like every song had its own identity. And again, Leroy's vocals, you know, are awesome in the sense that he is understandable. He's in your face. He's energetic. And you mix that energy with well, they're not really clean vocals, but like the spoken word parts, which is really just more like shouting, you know? And I always like that, because that they use that almost as like a substitute for clean vocals, you know? And but for whatever reason, like the hardcore fan in me is like, yeah, I'd rather just hear this dude yelling it, you know, instead of like, because you guys know how it is. You go see a band, they're all like brutal, 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 and then see Demon Hunter.
I was gonna say Devil Wears Prada, like their first two albums.
Yeah, it takes you out of it. You know, it takes you out of it. Whereas, you know, they kind of took a play from Killswitch Engage's book, where it's like, well, why don't we just yell something, you know, over some of these more epic parts? And War of Ages really kind of does it better, because Killswitch sometimes gets a little too buried in the singing, you know. And the early War of Ages stuff, I kind of appreciated that it was basically super melodic, but basically devoid of clean vocals.
It kind of reminds me, and you might hate me for making this comparison, but when I first heard Pride of the Wicked, I compared it a lot to Life in Your Way, where it's very Life in Your Way is way more core, but it's very, very heavy. But every song just has an uplifting feeling, even without knowing the lyrics or reading the lyrics. Just the music itself, it feels very like triumphant. It's not like dark and moody, like, that epic sound, but like almost in like major key. It's just like you listen to it, you just feel uplifted.
Yeah, I mean it's a battle, but you're winning the battle.
Exactly.
You're that overpowered, Doomslayer in the middle of a bunch of demons. It's definitely a unique feeling because so many bands were trying to just one up the moodiness of other bands. I'm sorry that we're only comparing them to other bands, but it's
one of the consequences of metalcore because it all sounded like this, kinda.
Yeah, it was the same genre, and I think that's important. But I also think it's important that, because one of the questions that I was asked, about this episode was, what are you even going to talk about War of Ages? And, do you think that they're really interesting enough to stand on their own? And I'm going to go ahead and say that they do, because again, there's so many bands. If you just type in metalcore into YouTube and listen to a playlist, probably 70 to 75% of the bands, especially from this era, you're not going to be able to tell them apart. And War of Ages is one of the few where it's like, okay, this is a little bit more metal. Like the actual guitar melodies aren't, oh, look at me, I can play melodic Gothenburg style riffs. It's more like, okay, I'm going to write this riff because it works best for the song, and I'm going to throw this lead over it, and it's going to be part of the melody of the song. So like there's actual composition, I guess is what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
Like, and that's you can hear that quality through the playing, and that there's a passion for it.
Agreed.
2007, Fire from the Tomb.
Oh, you mean the War of Ages self-titled?
The greatest cause of atheism in the world today. I had to bring it up.
Okay.
It's a great soundbite. It works, but I will go on record saying that DC Talk used it better. Sorry, guys.
I mean, those freaks. Fire from the Tomb was obviously the result of a band that was dissatisfied with the way that their debut album sounded.
Accidental snare hits.
There's not a whole lot of this, a whole lot of that on Fire from the Tomb. But essentially, Fire from the Tomb is the self-titled album completely re-recorded from the ground up. And they added an extra song in there, too. And was it one song or two songs? It was just one.
The Awakening.
Yeah. They threw it right in the middle. But yeah, so, I mean, if you liked the first album, you're going to like this album because they're the same album. But personally, I kind of like the self-titled more. Just because it has that debut album feel. This is a more experienced band coming in and giving the best treatment to their old songs that they can give. But there's certain parts of it that I almost feel like are more mechanical and not necessarily as heartfelt as what they were on the debut. But I think a lot of that comes from the fact that I heard those songs first in that format first. And with Fire from the Tomb, if you didn't know any better, it just sounds like a new War of Ages album,
So it's funny because like I was the opposite. I heard Pride of the Wicked first, and I don't think I heard self-titled until like after Arise and Conquer or like after Eternal. So I definitely heard Fire from the Tomb, and I might not have even noticed that it was a re-recording of any, only because I think this album is a little bit metal side than Arise and Conquer, Pride of the Wicked was in like the hardcore side. So hearing this, to me, it seems like a natural evolution of like, all right, Pride of the Wicked is metalcore heavy on the core, and from Fire on the Tomb onward through the rest of their career, it's metalcore heavier on the metal. And that's why I never realized that it was a re-recording. So going back and listening to it, I definitely appreciate the rawness of the first one. Like the Chariots Out first album is my favorite because of the rawness. I'll say the same with this. But everything is objectively better with Fire of the Tomb from a production standpoint, from just the way everything clicks in, from no accidental snare hits, except for one small detail that gets me every time I listen to this, and that's the hi-hat. The hi-hat on this album, for some reason, for years I thought it was my headphones or like my mix, whatever copy but after talking to you last night, I guess it's not just me.
No, you can definitely hear it, and it's just, I don't know, man. It's like being stabbed in the ears with little pins. I don't really know how to describe it. I had a very similar complaint about Zayo's Awake album. having that, like, everything's great, but like if you start focusing in on that hi-hat, it becomes all you can hear.
Once you notice it, you can't not hear it on every song.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's so frustrating. And like, I'm not usually that picky. Well, I'm pretty picky, but
Really?
like not about stuff like that. Like I don't, like, Joe's more likely to notice something like that than I am. Or I might notice it but not really know how to describe it. But yeah, like this is the result of a record that's like so clean sounding that you sometimes hear like the glaring ring outs and the like just stuff that I don't know. Like, I don't really know what I'm talking about as far as production goes. I'll go on record and say that, but it's hard to listen to for me whenever I'm paying attention, but sometimes I can still listen and not notice it.
I don't think War of Ages ever put out a bad album. There's some albums that I like a little bit better. I don't think Face Down's ever put out a bad album. So if we're sitting here kind of complaining about the hi-hat, that's kind of like a testament.
Flee the Scene. Sorry.
Oh, I love that album. I love that album. But
okay.
For us to be complaining about like the mix of the hi-hat, that's like a testament to just their consistency, Yeah,
I'm really reaching for stuff to complain about.
We're looking, man. We have to say something negative, but like songs like Stand Your Ground and like Battle On, I don't think they played Battle On live. That song is just so friggin' badass. I love that.
Yeah. For me, it's fun to listen to the record because, like you said, it's a band who was not satisfied with their first record, but I think this was more of a Zayo situation where somebody wanted a record right after Pride of the Wicked, and the solution was, let's re-record our first album because nobody has that, and then we can put more time into it and clean it up and make it sound like War of Ages in 2007. You're not going to be as satisfied listening to it if you're a fan of the first record because sometimes the mistakes are okay. Let's talk about recording in the early to mid 2000s. Everybody could do it on a laptop, so they spent a lot of time cleaning it up and making it sound absolutely fucking perfect. And as soon as you take out the humanity in the recording, you start to hear the robotic tendencies. And whoever mixed the record probably made the best decisions they could in 2007. I'm pretty sure at that point we were mixing records with MP3s in mind because everybody assumed you were going to rip that CD and put it on your iPod. It is what it is, but it's the first record again. And between the two, if I could find the self-titled, I think I'd have more fun listening to it. But since I can't find that, Fire from the Tomb is what I have.
Fair enough.
2008, Arise and Conquer.
I mean, all-consuming fire burn. I mean, what else is there to say? It's like literally the best way to start an album I've heard in a long time. Like, for me, it's right up there with Zayo's Once Again to Strive. Like, it's this is like if you needed to describe War of Ages to somebody in 3 seconds, those are the 3 seconds that you play. You get everything. I mean, like, you get Leroy screaming, all-consuming fire burn. It's like heavy breakdown, and then you get this like insane doubled guitar lead in each. It's like a mini bite-sized War of Ages. But then you have a whole album after that.
But this first song, like all-consuming, like it's only like minutes, a little over 4 minutes long. It just feels like it never ends because every time you feel like it ends, they're gonna come in with another like all-consuming fire burn, like gang chant. And that's why, so it's the best intro to any song, to any album ever, like one of the best. But then like every time I've seen them for the most part, they finish with all consuming fire. So this last time we saw them, they ended out, night one of Face Down Fest. Of course, they end with all consuming fire. Crowd goes nuts. Everyone's bum rushing the stage. And then you kind of hear like a few whimpered like encore chants, like one more song, two more songs. But like everyone knew that it wasn't going to happen because they just played all consuming fire. This is like their Memphis Be Laid to Waste. This is their like Rain in Blood. This is their song that like everyone comes to the War of Ages show.
They could have just came out and played it again.
Everyone would be so happy.
Extended it by like 15 minutes.
Be like Michael Flatley in fucking Riverdance where he brings the whole crew out and they just do that one dance thing like 7 or 8 times at the end of the show. How many times is War of Ages going to play All Consuming Fire tonight?
Till the people pack up, go home.
It's an absolute barn burner, man. Like, it really is. And, and that's just the first song, and pretty much everything we've said about the band up to this point applies, except for the fact that I feel like this is where the hardcore elements kind of start to fade out a little bit, and the band goes more in a metal focus. Like you start marketing themselves more as a metal band, and you get more solo-y stuff, more tremolo picking, more guitar leads overall, man. Just leads everywhere you look, and solos, and it just doesn't break away from metalcore, but they're definitely not trying to appeal to the hardcore kids anymore. They're trying to go general market metal.
Yeah, this is when they start kind of like putting their foot in the sand. They start moving like metalcore, metal heavy metalcore, and it kind of grows with each album. Return to Life has a little bit more of a hardcore element to it than Eternal.
Yeah.
But this is the first one where they're like, yeah, let's step away from, there's not as many gang chants in this one. Leroy's vocals are a little bit more on the metal side. He kind of like steers away from the hardcore element, but you can still hear and understand every word he says. And he can throughout his career, which just sets him apart as a friend.
Absolutely. Enunciation is important. I want to understand what you're saying, not have to read the lyric sheet.
Yeah, and you definitely can. It might take a couple of repeated listens, but because, most of the time you're just too busy headbanging to care.
Absolutely. It's all about the fucking riffs.
Probably one of my favorite songs on this record is Through the Flames. Just the way it starts off, it almost sounds like an Amon Amarth song. It comes in so heavy. And this is where I kind of started to feel like the band sounded how their album covers looked. It's not so much that the old albums didn't evoke that feeling, but like this one really did. And again, to mention the cover artwork, it's like a warrior like stabbing a T-Rex in the face. Okay, it's not a T-Rex. I know it's a dragon. It has wings, but it looks like a T-Rex's head. So I'm just gonna say it was a dude stabbing a T-Rex through the throat. Okay, and like the gang chant. The gang chorus basically on Through the Flames is like worth the price of admission alone.
Absolutely.
This is where they took the gang vocals and somehow made them less hardcore and more metal. But I guess it does still have a little bit of that hardcore sing along. And this was kind of the last War of Ages album that was like mostly, as far as I know, like devoid of clean vocals. Like they yelled and they kind of talked their way through some chorus type stuff, but there was still no clean singing. It was still rough and heavy.
Is that the hardcore that the band was rooted in? You get the talking vocals with the screaming, not so much the metal singing or even the yelling. I guess the yelling's part of it too.
Yeah, it's definitely that hardcore influence with the yelling and the talking through it. Maybe you might say a little bit of rap rock influence, but this is definitely when they really start to formulate that War of Ages sound that's just akin to who they are. I also think Tim Lambesis might have helped produce the re-recording for Fire of the Tomb, but he definitely produced this one, which is kind of cool because he did a couple albums by them we were talking about, and you definitely hear the more metal come out of it on this and then into the next couple.
Yeah, they're definitely pushing in that direction, and this is probably my favorite one. I really like the self-titled a lot, though, but it's kind of lame to be like, oh yeah, my favorite's the first one. This is definitely a little bit more representative of how the band sounds overall. But I do feel like there was a distinct turn. But like I said, this record was a little bit more general market in the sense that like the songs actually had defined choruses, even though they weren't clean vocals, or they weren't using like a lot of the tricks that bands use. This was the first album that I really felt like they went into the more traditional song structures. They're going to get it past you because you're still into the riffs, you're still into the solos and everything. It's going to be a little bit more evident the direction that they were going in whenever we get to Eternal.
2010.
Oh, where do we begin with Eternal?
It goes on forever?
No, it's actually
30 minutes.
It's fairly brief. War of Ages is never in the business of wasting too much of your time. I remember being really shocked by this record. I bought it at a Target, believe it or not. It was like a Target or a Walmart or something, and I didn't even know that War of Ages had a new album out, really. I just happened to see it, and of course it had great cover artwork. I think I was either into Oblivion or Skyrim that year. And the cover artwork definitely rang with me, and but I wasn't really prepared for how it was going to sound, because like Collapse comes on and it sounds like a softer band is like featuring Leroy on like guest vocals. Was the impression that I got. I was like, what is going on here? Like it starts off clean singing, and I don't know, it's just got that like, I don't know, like faux epic, you know, so like comes in like really melodic, this dude singing, and then Leroy starts screaming, and you know, pretty much like, I don't know, like a minute into the song is whenever it really starts kicking off and then starts sounding like War of Ages again.
Yeah, is that like kind of like that slow build up? But this is like the first time where they like Leroy shows his like clean singing chops in a big way, and like super like way more often on this record. Kind of comes out of nowhere, but I didn't listen to it when it first came out. I was kind of like, I was in college, I was doing my folk rock, my indie rock, you know, phase at that point, and then came back into heavy music and had to backtrack and like pick up on all these other War of Ages albums. So when I got to this, I was like, I wasn't feeling it at first. I think maybe it was just my throwness of, you know, oh, they got way too many cleans, so I'm not gonna really pay attention to this. But then the more I listen, yeah, I know you do. I know you do. But the more I listened to it, man, I was like, you know, one, Leroy can actually sing, you know, and he gets it done. And the songs on this one are a little bit more catchy than Arise and Conquer are, and Pride of the Wicked, obviously, on the metal side. And it brought me back into it.
Forgive my ignorance, but I didn't know that was Leroy singing.
It might not be. I might get called out on that one again.
Okay, I was going to say, and honestly, though, my ignorance only comes from the fact that, like, I don't know, it just doesn't sound like him singing, in the sense that, like, a lot of bands at this time, you know, usually it'd have, like, the guitar player or bass player or somebody do the cleans. But I could be totally wrong. He could have laid down all those vocals himself. I really don't know. You know, hopefully if
everyone on stage has a microphone when they play the song, and
well, because you got to have those gang chants.
Gotta have them, man. But I mean, it's also late, and I worked all day, so my brain's a little fuzzy.
Totally fine. The discussion begins and ends with the clean vocals are there, and it's the first time we've heard this with War of Ages. And I don't think that they really overdo it. You know, because you kick right into Desire. Featuring Tim Lambesis, and it's like Tim and Leroy like trading off, and it sounds awesome. Like, I'll say it, like, this is before the stigma, this is before, you know, everything was weird. So yeah, like that year I was excited to hear Tim on that song, you know. And but yeah, you're definitely hitting on, like, there's a lot more chorus, there's a lot more like general market stuff, and I'm totally fine with that. Like, I don't fault the band for using more traditional song structures. This was, I believe, the very first War of Ages record that charted. Was it like,
you are correct?
Yeah, 179, you know? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, they were obviously doing something right. Like, they knew that this was going to appeal to the general audience more than maybe, you know, because in order to like War of Ages through Rise and Conquer, you have to at least be familiar with and like metalcore. This is a little bit more of like a gateway record. If you weren't like totally sold on heavy music yet, you could listen to Eternal and maybe get into it off of that, you know, because it's a little bit more extreme than maybe, you know, stuff that was on the radio, but it was melodic enough and chorusy enough to get people interested. But what I like about it too, though, is they were able to still do this while still sounding like War of Ages, you know, because like you look at a band like Demon Hunter that, you know, could be described as a band that is also a gateway band. War of Ages didn't start as a gateway band like Demon Hunter did, so their music is still more complex than some of those other gateway bands out there. So like, I feel like it was kind of a double hitter in that they were able to appeal to their existing fan base. I don't think anybody like hated this as soon as they heard it, if they were a fan of the old albums. But I also think people that never heard the band before, this was like actually a really good jumping on point, despite some of the weirdness.
Well received.
Yeah,
it seems like it was pretty well received. It's their cleanest record to date, like from a production standpoint. Like, it's clean, it's polished, it's smooth. Like you were saying, the choruses, they're catchy. They have Tim's on it. On the title track, they bring in Sonny from POD. If you want to talk about like general market, they're bringing in like a huge, you know, front man from, you know, that kind of broke from the Christian scene to the secular scene and survived and lived to tell about it for a little bit. Bringing him on the record, getting some of that more rap rock. See, rap rock's all over War of Ages. I'm not going to let
You're not gonna let that die. You're just gonna.
I'm not gonna. That's it. I'm gonna die on that hill. A hill that die.
That's the hill that you're gonna die upon. Okay, got it.
This is 2010. Is it fair to say that mainstream metalcore had fully transitioned into the Killswitch Engage style of I'm going to sing the chorus, I'm going to scream the verses, but I'm not just going to sing the choruses, I'm going to really sing the choruses. So the melodic vocals are an expectation at this point. It's more mainstream for War of Ages, but they still pull it off.
They pull it off because, some of the songs, the clean vocals were used as the chorus, but not all. Every song doesn't have your, Demon Hunter clean chorus and rough verse. They kind of throw stuff in a little bit more sparingly. But I guess one thing that really makes this stand apart is they were able to do this without really sacrificing their heaviness. Like whenever they go full bore, they still go full bore. You know what I mean? There's no holding back. The only thing that you could say is held back is the production quality is so clean that maybe it doesn't sound as raw as maybe a band like this should sound. But I mean, that's the metalcore market in 2010. I mean, what do you want me to do? This is what they're going to sound like.
So like metalcore as a whole kind of veered away from kind of like the beat down sound of it and the beat down ground and pound, and more into this clean sound. When you're listening to it, it's still very much War of Ages. It's not just a clean metal album, a really sick Dave Quiggle art piece put on the front cover. Like it's still War of Ages. It's still Leroy. It's still Steve on guitar. Like you can hear those traditional sounds come out of it, just with a little bit more cleans.
Yeah, totally. And I think this was definitely a landmark for them as far as their success. And their success also can't just be chalked up to, we just got a little bit cleaner on this one. They were touring like nonstop, man. Like they were bringing War of Ages to the masses.
5 records in 5 years, and they basically never stopped touring.
Yeah.
I think we can say they earned it and leave it at that.
Yeah, they earned having Sonny from POD on it, on a track. And, I thought that was, to be honest, that Sonny's guest vocal on that just always throws me off. Like it just doesn't in a certain sense it sounds cool, but I just don't feel like it should be there. I don't know. That's just like my opinion, man. 2012,
Return to Life.
Were we dead at some point? Oh wait, they were the army of the undead, right? So this is where they come back.
On the fields of Gondor. But this is where we return.
Are they evil Ash or good Ash?
They're probably good Ash, I would say. Just based on their lyrics and imagery and all of that.
So Return to Life, but the first track is Immortal.
Right.
I'm starting to get some mixed messages here, guys.
You guys got to think about these things before you just throw them out there.
Again, we're trying to strain in to find something negative.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with Return to Life. The only issue I have with it, really, we're reaching the point now where it's like it's another War of Ages album, and that's all it is. It's
if it hadn't happened already, it was going to happen eventually, and this is where you just listen to the record, and it's War of Ages for 43 minutes, roughly.
Yeah, 36. Yeah.
So they got it's not copy paste. Like it's definitely, when you listen to it, it's like, okay, this is definitely Return to Life. Like Fallen Idol is probably my favorite song on this album. So it still has like those standout track. It has that that sweet minute long acoustic guitar halfway through the album and kind of break it up a little bit. So they did do some different things, but it's kind of like a growing, they were still War of Ages. They were still doing exactly what they did to get them to this point. It wasn't a huge step in any different direction to set it apart from anything they've done. But at the same time, do you really have to when it's War of Ages and what you do just sounds so great and it fits? Don't fix what's not broken. And that's kind of what I feel about this record. Don't fix what's not broken.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those, I can nitpick it for not being the most original record in the world, but at the same time, it still kind of is. Everything that we've said about War of Ages up to this point is still true on this record. It's just that, especially listening to all of it in 1 week, like I said, this is the first time I've ever just had a War of Ages marathon, and listened to everything.
And it was epic as fuck, wasn't it?
For the most part, it was, yes. And like I said, I really didn't ever have any real problems with it. It's just that I kind of, so there's fan of the band Dan, and then there's music critic Dan. Fan of the band Dan says, great, keep it up. Because, in a certain sense, a lot of bands that played this style were kind of trying to move away from this style around this time, like 2012, if you go heavier, you're like firmly rooted in deathcore territory, if you go softer, then you're a sellout piece of crap, which, I mean, they kind of went softer, but not really. They added softer elements without actually going soft, like, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, like, they didn't really, like, sell out in the traditional sense or anything like that. They added some clean choruses, but they did that on the last album, so it's nothing new, But I give them props for staying metalcore when it would have been really easy for them to jump on some other bandwagon. And this is, the test of time is how you find out if a band you like is trendy or not. And you start realizing that this just is War of Ages. There's no trendiness. There's no deception. There's no, like, we're going to change to try to sell records, or we're going to, because I don't really think adding melodic elements is the same thing as changing.
No.
Because you'd have to change in order to, like, we'd have to have a record of, like, all clean vocals and, like, tons of acoustic guitars for me to be like, War of Ages is a total sellout band, It just felt weird even saying that. Nobody would ever say that, But yeah, Return to Life is a record that I can listen to and enjoy. It's just overshadowed by records that I have stronger personal feelings for.
Yeah, it's not at the top of my favorite War of Ages album, but, when I listen to War of Ages, most of the time it's just me putting on War of Ages, their entire discography, and just hitting shuffle and just
right.
blowing through their songs, And when these songs come in, it's not like that I'm skipping over the tracks. I'm not hitting next. I'm still jamming to it, but yeah, I'm not going to say more of the same. I'm going to say consistent.
There you go.
2014, Supreme Chaos.
I really like this one. I know me and David might have some disagreements on this one, but I found this one to actually be kind of refreshing because it sounds markedly different than a lot of other War of Ages albums. The biggest difference is obviously the heavy use of electronics, which on one hand kind of takes you out of the whole epic metal feel about it, because for whatever reason, when you add electronics to metal, you have to, like, really know what you're doing, or else people are like, you lose metal fans on stuff like that.
Yeah,
basically.
That's huge, Joe.
That's 100% the case. I think we can blame dubstep for the electronics, because what was the reason to add a keyboardist and a vocoder to War of fucking Ages?
Oh man, Joe's taking a stand. With every breath and all that he is.
I don't dislike the record. It's entertaining, but what's the fucking point? I want to be in on the conversation between 2012 and 2014 where somebody said, you know what we're going to do on this record, guys? Vocoder and keyboards. And we're just going to add in a shit ton of atmosphere. It was modern metal that I hate before modern metal was popular. War of Ages is the reason. I'm not going to say that, guys, but I really want to.
But okay, so what you're saying is that they were the forerunners of that? Is that what you're saying?
I think they were trying to add something to their music that was being used differently by other bands. Dubstep, basically. Your A Plea for Purging type bands were already using electronics at that point, but they were using it to enhance the depth of what was otherwise an extremely detuned heavy metal record. But what War of Ages did with it kind of preceded the trends that your Asking Alexandrias would do years later. They just played the same melodic heavy metal and added electronics to it, which made it sound semi-artificial, but they didn't take it to the extreme of, we're going to overdub every fucking hit.
So I've already made the case that, I'm the meathead that the more clean singing, the more electronics that go into the album, the less I'm probably going to like it. And that was the case when Supreme Chaos came out, because I was already back into the heavy music scene. Supreme Chaos dropped. Super excited for another War of Ages album, and then the opening track From Ashes with that electronic feel in the beginning kind of threw me off. Still love the songs. It's a great metal album, but I didn't fully appreciate it again until I saw them play these songs live. And then, Joe, that atmosphere, like you were saying, trans so well in a live setting that going back and listening to the record, I got it, and it made sense to me.
I actually hated this record when it came out for a lot of the similar reasons. So like, oh my God, what is this? What are they doing? But I mean, this is 2020. This is the post NF episode, Dan. And I actually really enjoyed hearing those electronics, especially with as much War of Ages as I listened to at one time. I listened to the discography 3 times to do this episode,
nice. Which
is unusual. Most times you're lucky if you get like one full playthrough. But in this case, I don't want to say I got bored, but when you can listen to their whole discography in an 8-hour workday, I listened to it and I'm like, wow, this is great. And the reason I'm listening that many times in a row is trying to find what makes each album unique. Mm-hmm. This record goes out of its way to try to break out of what we were complaining about the previous record, where we're like, because like we felt like, oh, great, it's another War of Ages album. That had to have been the mindset going into this, was like, how do we make this not just sound like what we've done before? How do we expand it out? One down note is I think there's just way too many cleans on this record. I feel like we're getting to a point where if Leroy's not the one singing the cleans, what is he even doing? On stage.
That's why I thought it was him, man.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder that as well. But we'll just have to have Leroy on the podcast sometime, and he can tell us how dumb we are.
I'm gonna get blown up the second you guys drop this episode of all the things that I said wrong.
Send all of your hate mail to David at.
Good, because I'm
if I wasn't the hardcore kid before recording this, I'm definitely a kid now. I'm
right.
showing my true colors.
Hey, it happens. There's just a lot of cleans on this record, and I'm not upset about that, but I'm not like super stoked about it either. But I mean, it was a good record for him, and kept him relevant. Again, War of Ages by 2014 is a band from 2005 that's still relevant, that's playing metalcore. Kind of not too common.
And at this point, they put out an album at least a year, if you don't count Fire of the Tomb as like in between 2006, 2008. But they're putting out an album consistently every other year. That's while touring like insane and then having their own lives on the side. It's pretty.
Yeah, for sure.
2017 Alpha. Is anybody disappointed that the next album wasn't called Omega?
I was waiting for it.
It would have been pretty cliche, I think.
Went a Demon Hunter route there.
It's a double album. You guys should you should pay whatever it would cost for like 3 vinyl for the 2 vinyl. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's 2017, so we're in that era now. I think I actually got this record as part of my Face Down Records, like $30 for 30 albums.
30 for 30, baby.
30 for 30, man. Joe and I both got it. We did an unboxing video. So if anybody goes back and watches that, they'll be like, you did not get this record through that, but I definitely got the last one in there. I got a whole bunch of War of Ages. Like it filled out my War of Ages collection. Like perfect. I went from only having like 3 or 4 records to having all of them. So thanks for that, Face Down. But this record's interesting because I feel like this was about as far as they could go with their newer like post Eternal sound. A lot of cleans. And I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of cleans. The songs try really hard to be dynamic, go from different moods. They actually get a little broody in places on this record, which they normally do. So that was kind of new and different. I think they're throwing a lot of stuff at the wall right now and trying to figure out like, how do we continue to be us without repeating ourselves over and over and over again?
Yeah, I think it's a good record. One thing I noticed that like almost every soft record until you get to like the last 2 or 3 starts out really soft and really like super quiet and like mellow, and then it builds into like that War of Ages sound. It's something a little funny but Joe, you're probably the person to ask about this. What was the recording atmosphere like in 2017 when this album came out? Because the songs are great. I like them. It's definitely War of Ages, but everything across the board just feels a little bit more flat than War of Ages in the past. The bass isn't bass. The treble's not as punchier. Everything just kind of seems a little bit more level than what we've heard. So.
Definitely in the heyday of digital, both engineers and artists who recorded independently had better tools, and in some cases, not better tools. I'm not going to get into the subject of whether or not you should be using a modeling device when recording or if an amp is better, because in some cases, and metal is one of those cases, it doesn't always matter. But we started to get more of the... People just started to add dynamics back into the music. We had many years of everything just cranked as loud as it could possibly be. I don't know when the loudness war ended, but this is 2017. This is the heyday of YouTube and independent creators. And the going trend was, if you don't mix your shit with dynamics, YouTube is going to mix it down for you. To this day, if you upload a loud video to YouTube, it's going to get turned down. No matter how loud you try to be to make more noise than the other artist, you lose because it's going to get turned down. Everybody's listening to their music online. We started to pay for streaming services. It's a great day if you're a fan of music, especially heavy metal. So everybody was kind of put on an equal playing field. And because of that, they started to pay more attention to dynamics and adding depth back into the music. I think with this type of metal, it was becoming less degent, and it was starting to transition into the modern metal of the past year and a half, 2 years. So this might be an example of a record at the peak of digital recording in the mid-2010s. This is right before we started to get the firepower from Judas Priest and the Coffin Train from Diamond Head. It was a good year because we all started to take our heads out of our asses.
This was also, right before the vinyl boom started hitting again, or maybe it was probably the same time. This is about when we started the podcast, 2017.
Absolutely.
And, it was definitely, it does sound flat. There's really no other way to say it. It sounds flat. It doesn't sound lifeless, but it's, for War of Ages, it kind of does. And again, I don't think this is their fault. I think they just went into a studio, recorded an album, and put it out, business as usual. But I also think that's kind of what hurts it too, in the sense that, again, we're reaching the point where we're like, they're trying new things, but it seems like they're falling back into the let's rely on the chorus. Let's throw some clean vocals in there, throw a couple of breakdowns, got to throw the heavy parts in for the old fans, and it just didn't seem like it was recorded with as much love as some of the previous albums. And at this point too, we've had lineup changes. We've essentially got a different band than what we started with. We still have Leroy, but for a band that toured as much as they did, like, lineup changes are expected at this point. So I can't bash the record because it's not a bad record, but they have better records than this, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I think it's a
not
foreshadowing.
My first play. Yeah.
It's it's not a bad record. I don't think they kind of like sit on their haunches and what War of Ages was as much, at least not in my opinion. I think that they're trying to find out what War of Ages is going to be. And if this was the last album that War of Ages put out, then yeah, maybe I would be a little bit disappointed, because you can kind of see where they're going, but quite get there on this album until what they drop.
Are we ready for Void?
I gave you the perfect segue.
2019.
This is like a, no pun intended, kind of a come to Jesus moment with a band like this. Again, we talked about how there may have been some struggle in, how do we do something different? This sounds unlike pretty much most of the other War of Ages albums, in the sense that it's not a return to life. It's not a return to the glory days. This is a band being like, we're gonna write songs with a fresh perspective, and we're gonna do it right. Like the composition, we're gonna approach the composition different. We're gonna throw the formula out the window, and we're going to record an album that we are personally proud of, that's going to be diverse, and we're not going to rely on our bag of tricks that we started the band with. This is totally different territory for them.
It's a totally different band. Like at this point, it's Leroy, it's Steve, and then we were talking about it earlier. This is like a face down super group, because you have guys representing obviously War of Ages, but then Flesh Killer and The Burial and Hope for the Dying. This is like take some of the biggest bands in face down records metal and throw them inside War of Ages and see what happens. And they put out, Pride of the Wicked. Maybe if I take the nostalgia out of it, this might be my favorite War of Ages album, because it has a little bit of everything for everyone. It opens up with kind of like Leroy, I hate to say it again, sorry, but I'll say his rhythmic delivery of lyrics in the opening line. I won't say rapper, but it works.
Kind of rappy. It's kind of
rappy. And it turned me off at first, especially for the opening, and then immediately kicks into War of Ages, and it's heavy as hell. And then you get some of that D-gent, as Joe says, great blast beats throughout this album. The solos are some of the best that they've ever written, and it all works. And then you still get the catchy choruses. You still get the cleans that are awesome to sing along to. I wish there'd be a little more gang vocals to kind of bring everything together. But this is, I think, exactly where War of Ages wanted to get to, and I'm so glad they arrived, and it might be my favorite album by them, nostalgia excluded.
I will not say that War of Ages is a technical band, but they have multiple instances along the way where if they wanted to do a Between the Buried and Me style chaos, time signatures, and just technical metal record, I believe they could do it. There has to be something in their mindset and in their mentality that they want to do songs, but they have multiple opportunities where they could go fully technical, and all of the technical fans would call them technical death metal, and we'd all love it. It would just be, why is this still called War of Ages?
So it would be Hope for the Dying with Leroy on vocals.
There you go.
Anybody going to complain about that?
Nobody.
No,
we are a pro Hope for the Dying podcast. So
amen. Amen.
But I think this was just the breath of fresh air that they needed, and I think that they'd had new players on the previous two records, and they had done kind of a lot of kind of different stuff, but always kind of kept it with the War of Ages formula. I think losing that formula was probably the best thing they could do. And this record sounds more like let's take advantage of the members that we have and let them play what they can play, versus maybe them having to necessarily subscribe to a certain structure or, a certain rules for doing things. And in that regard, it is a really great record because it is so markedly different than anything else they've done in the past. And I enjoy it. Like the keyboards and stuff, that's very different. And they achieve epic differently than they've achieved it in the past. And it's a cool look for them.
There's not one thing on this record that they do that's different, that's overdone. And I think that's something you can't see as confidently with their past albums. You can see you hear a little bit more electronics and Supreme Chaos. You hear a lot of the cleans, but this one they do everything perfect. If we are going to strain gnats here and split hair in miles apart, Leroy throws down a really in the middle of one of the breakdowns, and I loved it so much. And I was waiting for him to do it when he played it live at Face Down Fest. And my boy Leroy let me down. He didn't hit me with the black, and it killed me. It broke my heart. And I hope you're listening, so you know how bad I feel.
Maybe he'd seen that meme where the dad's on the plane with the kid, and a guy drops to the floor with a heart attack, and everybody's like, "Oh my god, what do we do? What do we do?" And the dad looks over at the kid and realizes, man, I guess they really need a doctor right now. They don't really need a deathcore vocalist. Maybe you should have thought about that before you became a deathcore vocalist. Why don't you run up to the guy and yell "blah" in his face and see if that helps? He must have just read that meme and then decided not to do it.
The Hulk does that to Iron Man at the end of the first Avengers film.
He has to.
I don't want to hear nothing.
I don't know, man.
Dying,
we all need a good bleh every now and again.
I was feeling it, man. I did it to myself, and he just kind of kept on headbanging and didn't even put the microphone to his mouth. It was heartbreaking.
Could be worse.
Oh,
He could
that's a
do the
bummer.
entire show with his hand out like this.
I mean, he does a lot of that.
It's okay every once in a while, but sometimes you want to go to the show and actually hear the vocalist do the vocals.
I don't know, man. I'm a hardcore kid. Give me the microphone. I'd rather do it myself.
I'll get up there and do it better. Yeah.
Such a meathead.
You guys want to hear
Right.
the story about when I DDT'd Dan on the stage of a Zayo show?
Nothing's more annoying than whenever like the band is like hyping up, the vocalist reaches the mic out, and some guy just goes, "Yeah." Jason Newsted did that at a Metallica concert one time, and James Hetfield gave him this look like, "What are you doing?" It's pretty funny. Off topic, but yeah, I mean, this band. What else is there to say about War of Ages? I guess this is where Joe's going to ask us for the final word.
Final thoughts on War of Ages. Dan.
Epic. War of Ages is an epic band that you should check out. If you're on the fence about whether you like metalcore or not, you're going to definitely figure it out when you're listening to this band. If you get halfway through and you're like, I hate all of this, then you don't like metalcore. But that's okay. I love the fact that they stuck with it as long as they did when so many of their contemporaries were like going in super weird directions. It's not that they didn't go in weird directions, but they always kept it metal. They kept it in your face, and they never compromised anything. And they're also one of the few Christian bands, if I can bring this up, that actually like really stuck to their belief system throughout their career, like this far into it. A lot of bands like this, when they started off in that Christian scene, whenever they started off, it was cool to be a Christian metalcore band. It became less cool over time, and that didn't really matter to them. They kind of stuck to their same vision. So, I mean, regardless of what side of the fence you're on as far as that belief system goes, you got to give credit where credit's due when people actually stick with what they believe and they make strong statements that they stand behind.
David, what about you?
I'll completely agree. You know, especially that last point. It's funny. Most of the Christian metalcore bands start out Christian and then slowly move away from that as they go. Then you get War of Ages where they start out Christian metalcore, and then now Leroy's like an ordained minister in his church, like completely opposite. You know,
that's the final completion of the journey, right?
There it is, man. But no, War of Ages, consistent. You're one of the few consistently great metalcore bands that you're going to find. Put on any album, and there's something to enjoy for everyone. Leroy is one of the dynamic. Well, yeah, I already went for it. Dynamic frontmen where you know it's him, and you hear every word he's saying. You can understand every word he's saying, and you hang on every. And that's hard to find in metalcore too. So yeah, 10 out of 10 would recommend.
I think War of Ages is one of the definitive metalcore bands. If you are a fan of riffs, heavy vocals, and intense drumming with gang vocal choruses, you can't go wrong with War of Ages. It's exactly what you were looking for. David, what's your album of the week?
Den's Taming Tongues features Leroy from War of Ages on track 2, and it's going to be the album of the year. Bet your money.
Dan, what about you?
Mine would have to be this little guy right here. This is Bow by Focused, and still one of my favorite hardcore albums of all time. It didn't age well. It sounds dated, but I love it.
When I'm having a bad day at work, I listen to very intense, very offensive hardcore punk. Today I was listening to the Anti-Nowhere League, but that's not heavy enough. So my album of the week is The Best Defense is Attack by Toe to Toe.
Oh man, that's some hardcore for you.
Completely opposite from Damien Rice, which was the last time.
Hey, we were talking about some seriously emotional shit on the last episode.
Yes, we were. Yes, we were. I'm still listening to NF all the time. It's
Text me about 3 a.m. at 3 a.m.
Yeah, I'm like, hey, this song 3 a.m. is really good. And he's like, aren't you supposed to be listening to War of Ages? Oh, yeah. That's super important. I should probably do that.
Take us out, DFT.
When you're listening to this podcast, has the thought ever occurred to you that, you know, you have a band that is one of your favorites that we don't know about? If that's you, all you got to do is reach out to us. Let us know that you're thinking that. We're totally on your side. We get it. You can send us an email at danandjoeshow@gmail.com. Let us know what band you want us to talk about. You can reach out to us on Facebook at facebook.com/discography discussion. You can send us a tweet at discussmetal or at discussmetaldan or discussmetaljoe, respectively. You can always talk to us on our Discord server, We'll send you, or actually, there's going to be a link in the show notes that you can click on that'll take you right to the wonderful world of Discord. So there's all kinds of ways you can get a hold of us. Let us know what bands you want to talk about, and we'll do it. At the same time, too, if you really want to represent Discography Discussion, you can buy yourself a Discography Discussion t-shirt or hoodie or comfy socks or really anything that you could ever imagine that you'd want our logo on. You can buy at our store. There'll be a link in the show notes. Check it out. Help support the podcast.
And on that note, this has been episode 162 of Discography Discussion. Thank you for listening. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at discussmetal. Subscribe to our podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts, including Google Play, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Visit discussmetal.com for all things Discography Discussion, and please send questions and comments to danandjoeshow@gmail.com. If you are not a patron, you can become one at patreon.com/discussmetal. We have some sweet perks.
Hey, Joe, can I have some money?
$1 gets you into that exclusive album review feed. Patreon.com/discussmetal.
Discuss it, or don't. I mean, it's fine.